A quiet evening in Rome. Close your eyes for a moment and let the world around you grow quiet. Let the sounds of your day fade into the background, the worries and tasks slipping away like water through open fingers. Tonight, we are going somewhere far away, somewhere ancient, somewhere that exists now only in stones and stories and the faint whisper of memory. Tonight, we are going to Rome. Imagine yourself standing on a rooftop in the heart of an ancient city. The sun is setting, and the sky above you is painted in shades of amber and soft rose, the light growing gentle and golden as it stretches across terracotta tiles and weathered marble columns. Below you, the city hums with the last activities of the day. Merchants are closing their stalls in the forum, folding lengths of cloth and stacking amphorae of olive oil and wine. Children are being called home by their mothers, their laughter echoing through narrow alleyways. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rings, slow and sonorous, marking the transition from day into evening. You can smell bread baking in a nearby bakery, the warm scent of grain and yeast mingling with the earthy aroma of dust and stone. There is wood smoke in the air, drifting up from countless hearths as families prepare their evening meals. If you listen closely, you can hear the murmur of voices, the creak of wooden cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant splash of water from one of the great fountains fed by the aqueducts that carry fresh water into the city from the distant hills. This is Rome. Not the Rome of emperors and legions, not yet. Not the Rome of marble monuments and triumphal arches, though those will come in time. This is simply a city, a place where people live and work and love and grieve, where ordinary days unfold one after another like beads on a string. And tonight, as the sky darkens and the first stars begin to appear, we are going to tell the story of how this city became something more. We are going to tell the entire story of the Roman Empire. Now, I want you to understand something before we begin. This is not a story that will rush. Rome was not built in a day, as the old saying goes, and neither will this tale hurry through the centuries. We have time. We have all the time in the world, here in the quiet of this evening. So let yourself settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and comfortable. This story will unfold gently, like a river finding its way to the sea. And you are welcome to drift along with it, however feels right to you. The story of Rome spans more than 1,000 years, from the humble villages on the 7 hills to the vast empire that stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. It is a story of farmers and soldiers, of senators and slaves, of poets and priests. It is a story of ambition and failure, of glory and sorrow, of human beings trying to build something lasting in a world that is always changing. But more than anything, it is a story of ordinary people. Because, while the histories often focus on the emperors and generals, the battles and the conquests, the real story of Rome is written in the lives of the millions of people who lived within its borders. The baker who rose before dawn to knead his dough, the mother who carried her child through crowded streets to the temple to pray for good health, the soldier who stood watch on a cold frontier, dreaming of the home he might never see again, the farmer who tended his olive groves and vineyards, watching the seasons turn and hoping for a good harvest. These are the people who built Rome. stone by stone, day by day, generation after generation. And these are the people we will walk beside as we journey through this story together. Let us begin at the very beginning, in a time so distant that it blurs into legend. Before there were emperors, before there were consuls and senators, before there was even a city called Rome, there were only the hills. 7 hills, rising gently from the marshy plain beside the winding Tiber River. And on those hills there were villages, small clusters of huts made from wood and thatch, home to shepherds and farmers who tended their flocks and worked their fields and knew nothing of the great destiny that would one day grow from this modest place. Imagine yourself there, in that distant time. The year is somewhere around 753 BCE, though, of course, no one living then would have counted time in such a way. The calendar we use now, the years that stretch backward and forward from a single point, would not exist for many centuries yet. To the people living on those hills, time was measured in simpler ways: the rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, the rhythm of the seasons, planting and harvest, the dry heat of summer and the cold rains of winter. You are a shepherd, perhaps, or the child of one. Your world is small but complete. You know every path on your hill, every grove of trees, every stream where your flock drinks in the afternoon heat. You know the faces of your neighbors, the families who have lived beside yours for generations. You know the gods who watch over this place, the spirits of the springs and forests, the great sky father Jupiter and the hearth goddess Vesta, whose flame must never be allowed to die. Your life is not easy, but it is yours. You work hard, as everyone does. You rise with the sun and labor until the light fades. You eat simple food, bread and cheese and olives, with meat on feast days if the gods have been generous. You sleep on a straw pallet in your family's hut, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustling of animals, the distant call of an owl, the soft breathing of your parents and siblings around you. You do not know that one day this place will be the center of the world. You do not know that the paths you walk will become paved roads stretching thousands of miles, that the simple shrine where you leave offerings will become a towering temple of marble and gold, that the descendants of your neighbors will rule over millions of people across 3 continents. How could you know such things? How could anyone? And yet, somehow, it will happen. Somehow, this small collection of villages on these 7 hills will grow into something unprecedented in human history. The Roman Empire will rise, will flourish, will shape the world in ways that echo still today, thousands of years later. The language spoken here will evolve into Italian and Spanish and French and Portuguese and Romanian. The laws written here will form the foundation of legal systems across the globe. The roads built here will become the template for highways that crisscross continents. The ideas born here about citizenship and governance and what it means to belong to something larger than yourself will influence thinkers and leaders for millennia to come. But all of that is still far in the future. Tonight, as the sun sets over the 7 hills, and the shepherds lead their flocks home, and the smoke rises from humble hearths, there is only this moment. There is only the quiet of the evening, the first stars emerging in the darkening sky, the gentle sounds of a small community settling in for the night, and there is a story waiting to be told. a story that will take us through centuries of triumph and tragedy, through the rise of kings and the birth of a republic, through civil wars and golden ages, through the slow transformation of a city into an empire and the long, gradual twilight of that empire's final days. It is a story that has been told many times before, but tonight we will tell it slowly, gently, in the way that stories were meant to be told, not as a list of dates and battles, but as a living thing, full of human hopes and fears and dreams. So settle in, dear listener. Let your breathing grow slow and easy. Let the tension leave your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. You are safe here, wrapped in the warmth of this ancient story. And whenever you are ready, we will take our first steps together down the long road of Roman history. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, these gentle explorations of the past, I would be honored if you would consider subscribing to this channel. That way, we can walk through history together again. Whenever you need a moment of peace, whenever the world feels too loud and too fast, and you long for a slower, quieter place. But for now, let us simply begin. Let us go back to the very start, to the 7 hills and the shepherds, to the legends and the truth intertwined, to the first chapter of the story of Rome. That evening deepens, the stars emerge, and our story begins. Humble beginnings, the 7 hills and the shepherds. Let us travel back now, back through the centuries, back before the marble and the monuments, back before the legions and the emperors, back to a time when Rome was nothing more than a handful of villages clinging to 7 gentle hills beside a river. The Tiber, they called it, a winding ribbon of brown water that flowed down from the mountains to the sea. And on the hills above its marshy banks, small communities of farmers and shepherds made their homes, living lives that were simple and hard and utterly unaware of the future that would grow from their modest beginnings. Imagine yourself there, in that distant age. The world is quieter than you might expect. There are no great cities nearby, no bustling metropolises with their noise and crowds. The Italian peninsula is a patchwork of small settlements, scattered across hills and valleys, each one governed by its own customs and traditions. The people who live here are Latins, one of many groups inhabiting this land. To the north are the Etruscans, a sophisticated people with their own language and art and religion. To the south are Greek colonies, outposts of a civilization that has already produced philosophers and poets and great works of architecture. And here, in the middle, are the 7 hills, where your people have lived for generations. Beyond counting, the hills have names that will one day be famous throughout the world. The Palatine, where the wealthiest families build their homes. The Capitoline, where the most sacred temples will stand. The Aventine, the Celian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal. Each hill has its own character, its own springs and groves, its own families who have tended the land since time out of memory. And between the hills lies a valley that is often flooded by the Tiber, a marshy lowland that will one day be drained and paved and transformed into the Roman Forum, the beating heart of an empire. But for now, it is simply a place where cattle graze and reeds grow tall, and children are warned not to wander too far into the wet ground. For now, there is no forum, no empire, no grand destiny. There is only the daily rhythm of life, the work that must be done to survive in a world where nothing is guaranteed. Your days begin early, before the sun has fully risen. There is water to fetch from the spring, animals to tend, fields to work. If you are a shepherd, you lead your flock out to the hillsides, where the grass is green and sweet, watching over them through the long hours of the day, protecting them from wolves and thieves, guiding them to fresh pastures as the seasons change. If you are a farmer, you work the soil with simple tools, planting wheat and barley and beans, coaxing life from the earth with patience and prayer. The work is never finished. There are fences to mend, roofs to repair, clothes to weave, food to preserve for the lean months of winter. Everyone in your family contributes, from the youngest child who can carry water to the oldest grandparent who can still card wool or mend a broken pot. Life is a collective effort, a shared struggle against the uncertainties of a world where a bad harvest or a sudden illness can mean disaster. And yet, there is also joy. There are feast days when the community gathers to honor the gods, to share food and drink, to sing the old songs and tell the old stories. There are weddings and births, moments of celebration that bring families together and strengthen the bonds that hold your small world intact. There are quiet evenings by the fire, when the work is done and the stars are bright and you can simply rest, listening to the sounds of the night, feeling the closeness of the people you love. The gods are everywhere in this world. You feel their presence in the rustling of leaves, in the flow of water, in the warmth of the sun on your face. Every spring has its spirit, every grove its guardian. The great gods watch over all Jupiter in the sky, Mars, who protects your fields and flocks, Vesta, whose sacred flame burns in every hearth. You leave offerings at small shrines, simple gifts of grain and wine and flowers, asking for protection, for good harvests, for healthy children, for all the blessings that make life bearable. It is into this world that the legend of Rome's founding is born. You have heard the story many times, told by elders around the fire, passed down through generations like a precious heirloom. It is a story of gods and mortals, of tragedy and triumph, of two brothers and a city that would change the world. The story begins with a princess named Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin sworn to chastity, who was visited by the god Mars himself. From that divine union, she bore twin sons, Romulus and Remus, but her uncle, a cruel king who had stolen the throne from her father, feared what these children might become. He ordered them to be drowned in the Tiber, cast into the muddy waters to be swept away and forgotten. But the river had other plans. The basket carrying the infants washed ashore at the base of the Palatine Hill, where a she-wolf found them and went, instead of devouring them, nursed them as her own. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the children and brought them home to his wife, and they raised the boys as their own sons. Never knowing the royal blood that flowed in their veins, the twins grew strong and brave, leaders among the shepherds and farmers of the hills. When they finally learned the truth of their birth, they overthrew their wicked Gredtuncle and restored their grandfather to his rightful throne. But they did not stay in that kingdom. They returned to the place where they had been saved, to the hills beside the Tiber, determined to found a city of their own. And here the story takes its tragic turn. The brothers quarreled over where the city should be built, over who should rule it, over the very name it would bear. The argument grew heated, then violent, and in the end, Romulus killed Remus, his own twin, his his own blood. The city was founded in sorrow, its first stones laid over the grave of a brother's betrayal. This is the legend, and like all legends, it holds truth and mystery intertwined. Perhaps there really were two brothers who fought for dominance over a small settlement on the Palatine. Perhaps the she-wolf was simply a symbol, or a misremembering of a human foster mother, whose name meant wolf in the old tongue. Perhaps the story is entirely invented, a way for later Romans to explain the origins of their city with drama and divine intervention. What we know for certain is simpler, but no less remarkable. Sometime around the 8th century, before the Common Era, the small villages on the 7 hills began to grow closer together. They shared festivals and markets, intermarried, built common shrines and meeting places. Slowly, gradually, they began to think of themselves not as separate communities, but as one people, one city. They drained the marshy valley between the hills, laying down roads and public spaces. They built a wall to encircle their growing settlement, defining its boundaries, marking the line between inside and outside, citizen and stranger. They created institutions to govern themselves, councils of elders and assemblies of citizens, systems for making decisions and resolving disputes. None of this happened quickly. It took generations, centuries even, for Rome to grow from a cluster of huts into something that could truly be called a city. But grow it did, slowly and steadily, like a tree putting down deep roots before reaching toward the sky. And through it all, the ordinary people continued their ordinary lives. They tended their flocks and worked their fields, raised their children and buried their dead, prayed to their gods and told their stories. They did not know that they were building an empire. They were simply trying to live, to survive, to make something good out of the brief years allotted to them. This is always the way of history. The great events that fill our textbooks are built on millions of small, forgotten moments. Every empire is made of individuals. Every civilization sustained by the daily labor of people whose names will never be recorded. The shepherds on the 7 hills did not know what they were beginning. They could not have imagined the legions and the aqueducts, the Colosseum and the Pantheon, the emperors and the fall. But in their quiet way, with their simple lives, they planted the seeds of all that was to come. And now, as we move deeper into this story, we will watch those seeds begin to grow. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, until what was once a village becomes a kingdom. And what was a kingdom becomes a republic. And what was a republic becomes the greatest empire the ancient world would ever know. But that is still ahead of us. For now, let the image of those early hills stay with you, green and gentle in the morning light, home to shepherds and farmers who asked nothing more than a good harvest and a peaceful life. Let their simplicity soothe you, their quietness calm you. We have many centuries still to travel, and there is no need to hurry. The story continues whenever you are ready. The kingdom and the early republic, learning to govern as the generations passed, and the villages on the 7 hills grew into something resembling a city. A new question began to emerge, one that would shape the destiny of Rome for centuries to come. How should this city be governed? Who should make the decisions that affected everyone? Who should lead in times of crisis? Who should speak for the people in matters of war and peace? These questions had no easy answers, and the Romans would spend hundreds of years experimenting, failing, trying again, slowly building the institutions that would one day govern half the known world. In the beginning, Rome was ruled by kings, not kings like you might imagine from fairy tales, with golden crowns and velvet robes, but something more modest, more practical. The early kings of Rome were chosen leaders, men selected for their wisdom and strength, their ability to unite the squabbling families and lead them through difficult times. They were farmers and warriors, priests and judges, responsible for everything from settling disputes to conducting sacred rituals to leading the army in battle. Tradition holds that there were 7 kings of Rome, spanning roughly 2.5 centuries. Their names have come down to us through legend and later histories, though separating fact from myth is nearly impossible at such a great distance. Romulus was the first, of course, the founder himself, who gave the city its name and its earliest laws. After him came Numa Pompilius, a peaceful king remembered for establishing Rome's religious institutions, for creating the calendar and the priesthoods, for building the Temple of Janus, whose doors stood open in times of war and closed in times of peace. Other kings followed, each contributing something to the growing city. Tullus Hostilius was a warrior who expanded Rome's territory and defeated neighboring tribes. Ancus Marcius built the first bridge over the Tiber and founded Rome's port at Ostia. The later kings were Etruscan, evidence of how deeply Rome was influenced by its more sophisticated northern neighbors. They brought new technologies, new religious practices, new ideas about architecture and engineering. Under their rule, the first great public buildings rose. The Forum was properly drained and paved, and Rome began to look less like a collection of villages and more like a genuine city. But kingdoms, as history teaches us again and again, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Power concentrated in the hands of one person, and the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, embodied all the worst qualities that absolute power can produce. Tarquin ruled as a tyrant, ignoring the advice of the Senate, executing his enemies without trial, taxing the people heavily to fund his ambitious building projects. He was feared rather than respected, obeyed rather than loved. And when his son committed an unforgivable crime, assaulting a noblewoman named Lucretia, whose subsequent suicide shocked the city, the people of Rome finally rose up against their king. The year was 509 BCE, or so tradition tells us. The Romans drove Tarquin and his family into exile, swearing an oath that they would never again be ruled by a king. The very word rex became hateful to them, a symbol of tyranny and oppression. And in place of the monarchy, they created something new, something that had never existed before on quite this scale. They created a republic. Now, let us pause here for a moment and consider what this meant. Imagine yourself as an ordinary Roman in those tumultuous days. Your whole life, and your parents' lives, and their parents' lives before them, you have lived under kings. The king was a fixed point in your world, as constant as the sun rising in the east. And now, suddenly, there is no king. The throne is empty, the palace abandoned. The old order has been swept away, and in its place there is only uncertainty, only questions without clear answers. What happens now? How do you govern a city without a king? Who makes the decisions? Who leads the armies? Who judges the disputes that arise between neighbors? These were not abstract philosophical questions for the Romans of 509 BCE. They were urgent, practical problems that needed to be solved if the city was to survive. The solutions they invented would take centuries to fully develop, but the basic outlines were established in those earliest years. Instead of one king ruling for life, there would be two consuls elected for a single year. Two, so that neither could become too powerful, so that each could check the ambitions of the other. 1 year, so that no one would have time to entrench himself, so that power would circulate among many different men rather than concentrating in a single pair of hands. The Senate, which had existed under the kings as an advisory council, now became the dominant institution in Roman politics. Its members were the heads of the most powerful families, the paters, the fathers, whose wealth and status gave them influence over the rest of the population. The Senate did not technically make laws, but its recommendations carried enormous weight. The senators were experienced men who had held office, who understood how the city worked, who had connections and resources that ordinary citizens could only dream of. And then there was the assembly, where common citizens gathered to vote on laws and elect officials. In theory, this gave every Roman a voice in how the city was governed. In practice, the system was designed to favor the wealthy, with votes weighted by property ownership and social class. But still, it was something. It was an acknowledgement that the people mattered, that their consent was necessary for legitimate government. These institutions did not spring into existence fully formed. They evolved over time through conflict and compromise, through crises that forced Romans to reconsider how they organized their society. One of the most important of these early struggles was the conflict between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the old aristocratic families, the descendants of the original senators who monopolized political power and religious authority. The plebeians were everyone else, the common people, the farmers and artisans and traders who made up the vast majority of Rome's population. In the early republic, plebeians could not hold high office, could not marry into patrician families, could not even know what laws governed them, since the laws were unwritten and interpreted by patrician priests. This arrangement could not last. The plebeians were the backbone of Rome's army, the soldiers who fought and bled for the city. They had leverage, and they learned to use it. In a series of confrontations spanning more than 2 centuries, the plebeians gradually won concessions from the patricians. They gained the right to elect their own officials, the tribunes, who could veto actions that harmed plebeian interests. They demanded and received a written law code, the 12 Tables, so that everyone could know their rights and obligations. Eventually, they won the right to hold any office in the state, even the consulship itself. These struggles were not peaceful or easy. There were moments when Rome seemed on the verge of civil war, when plebeian soldiers threatened to secede and found their own city, leaving the patricians to defend Rome alone. There were riots and assassinations, demagogues and reactionaries, but somehow, through it all, the Romans found ways to compromise, to adapt their institutions to changing circumstances, to absorb conflict rather than being destroyed by it. This capacity for adaptation would prove to be Rome's greatest strength. Other ancient states were often rigid. their institutions fixed in place by tradition or religious sanction. Rome was different. Romans were pragmatic, willing to change what was not working, to borrow good ideas from other peoples, to experiment and adjust. Their constitution was never written down as a single document, but existed as a living tradition, constantly evolving in response to new challenges. For the ordinary Roman watching these great changes unfold, life went on much as it always had. You still rose before dawn to work your fields or tend your shop. You still prayed to the same gods, celebrated the same festivals, worried about the same things that people have always worried about: health, family, making ends meet. The political struggles among the great men seemed distant, something that happened in the Forum and the Senate House, while you were busy with the endless tasks of daily survival. But these changes mattered, even if you did not fully understand them. The laws that protected your property, the courts that heard your disputes, the officials who maintained order in the streets, all of these things depended on the institutions being built and refined through those years of struggle. The Republic was not perfect. It was never perfect. But it was Rome's attempt to govern itself fairly, to balance the interests of the powerful and the common, to create a system that could endure. And endure it did for nearly 5 centuries. The Roman Republic would survive invasions and civil wars, would expand from a single city to master the entire Mediterranean world, would produce some of the most remarkable leaders and thinkers of the ancient world. It would also produce terrible violence and inequality, slavery and conquest, all the darkness that shadows every human civilization. Expansion and struggle. The Republic grows for a long time. Rome was just one city among many in the Italian peninsula, surrounded by rivals and enemies who watched its growth with suspicious eyes. But slowly, steadily, over the course of several centuries, Rome expanded outward from its 7 hills, absorbing neighboring peoples, building alliances, fighting wars that gradually extended its influence until all of Italy was under its control. And then, with the momentum of a stone rolling downhill, Rome continued outward still, across the sea to Africa and Spain, east to Greece and beyond, until what had begun as a city became something unprecedented in the ancient world. Let us walk through this expansion together, not as a list of battles and conquests, but as a human story, experienced by the ordinary people who lived through it. Because while the historians focus on generals and strategies, the real weight of empire was carried on the shoulders of common soldiers and their families, people who had little say in the decisions that shaped their lives, but who bore the consequences nonetheless. Imagine yourself as a farmer in central Italy, sometime in the 4th century before the Common Era. Your family has worked this land for generations, growing wheat and tending vines, raising children who will inherit the farm after you. Life is hard but predictable, governed by the seasons and the cycles of planting and harvest. You pay your taxes, honor the gods, try to stay out of trouble, and then the call comes. Rome is at war again, as Rome always seems to be at war, and every citizen who owns property is obligated to serve. You leave your farm in the care of your wife and elderly parents, take up your spear and shield, and march off to join the legions. You do not know how long you will be gone. You do not know if you will ever come back. This was the reality for countless Roman men during the centuries of expansion. The Roman army was not a professional force of career soldiers, not yet. It was a citizen militia composed of farmers and craftsmen who served when called and returned home when the campaign was over. In theory, this system ensured that every citizen had a stake in the city's success. In practice, it meant that wars were fought by men who longed to be elsewhere, whose farms and businesses suffered in their absence, whose families struggled to survive without them. The wars themselves were brutal, as all wars are. The Romans fought against the Gauls, who poured down from the north, sacking the city itself in 390 BCE in a trauma that would haunt Roman memory for centuries. They fought against the Samnites in the mountains of central Italy, a series of grinding conflicts that lasted generations. They fought against the Greek cities of southern Italy, bringing them into alliance or subjugation one by one. Each victory brought new territory, new peoples to incorporate into the growing Roman system. The Romans were surprisingly flexible in how they treated conquered peoples. Some became full citizens, with all the rights and obligations that entailed. Others became allies, governing themselves but obligated to provide soldiers for Rome's wars. Still others were reduced to subjects, their lands confiscated, their people enslaved. This system of incorporation was one of Rome's great innovations. Rather than simply conquering and exploiting, the Romans offered a path to belonging. A Latin ally today might become a Roman citizen tomorrow, his sons serving in the legions, his grandchildren indistinguishable from the descendants of the original 7 Hills. This created enormous loyalty and resilience. When Rome was threatened, its allies generally stood firm, knowing that their fate was bound up with Rome's success. But the greatest test of this system, and of Rome itself, came from across the sea. Carthage was a wealthy and powerful city on the coast of North Africa, founded by Phoenician traders centuries before Rome even existed. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage controlled a commercial empire that stretched across the western Mediterranean, including much of Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. Conflict between these two expanding powers was perhaps inevitable. The Punic Wars, as they came to be known, were the defining struggle of Republican Rome. They lasted, on and off, for more than a century. From 264 to 146 BCE, they tested Rome's strength and resilience to the absolute limit. And they produced one of the most famous military campaigns in all of history. His name was Hannibal Barca, and he was Carthage's greatest general, perhaps one of the greatest generals who ever lived. In 218 BCE, Hannibal did something that no one thought possible. He marched an army from Spain across the Pyrenees, through the hostile territory of southern Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy itself. He brought with him infantry and cavalry, and, most famously, elephants, great war beasts that had never been seen in Italy before. The crossing of the Alps was a nightmare. The mountain passes were narrow and treacherous, the weather brutal, the local tribes hostile. Hannibal lost thousands of men and most of his elephants to cold, starvation, and ambush. But he pressed on, driven by a burning hatred of Rome that had been instilled in him since childhood. When Hannibal descended from the mountains into the plains of northern Italy, he caught the Romans completely off guard. In a series of devastating battles, he destroyed army after army sent against him. at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most catastrophically at Cannae in 216 BCE, where perhaps 50,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon, the worst military defeat in Roman history. Imagine the terror that gripped Rome in those years. An enemy army loose in Italy, seemingly invincible, destroying everything in its path. Every family had lost someone, a father or son or brother, who had marched away and never returned. The city itself seemed on the verge of destruction, the walls that had protected it for centuries suddenly feeling thin and fragile against this relentless foe. And yet, Rome did not surrender. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact of the entire war. Despite losses that would have broken almost any other state, despite the defection of some allies and the threat of more, despite the enemy camping within sight of the city walls, Rome refused to give in. The Senate met and made its decisions with grim determination. New armies were raised from the survivors and from those too young or too old to have served before. The strategy shifted from direct confrontation to patient containment, avoiding battle, harassing Hannibal's supply lines, slowly wearing down his strength. For 15 years, Hannibal remained in Italy, winning battle after battle, but never able to strike the final blow. The Roman alliance system held, mostly. The city itself never fell, and eventually Rome carried the war to Africa, threatening Carthage itself and forcing Hannibal to return home to defend it. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, the Romans finally defeated him, ending the Second Punic War and establishing Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The third and final Punic War, 50 years later, was less a war than an execution. Rome, still haunted by the memory of Hannibal, decided to destroy Carthage completely. The city was besieged, captured, and literally erased from the earth. Its buildings were torn down, its population killed or enslaved, its very soil supposedly sown with salt, so that nothing would grow there again. It was an act of vengeance, so total, so final, that it shocked even some Romans, but by then, Rome's expansion could not be stopped. The legions marched east, conquering the Greek kingdoms that had once seemed the pinnacle of civilization. They marched north into Gaul, south into Africa, east into Asia. By the 1st century BCE, Rome controlled virtually the entire Mediterranean world, a domain so vast that it took months to travel from one end to the other. For the ordinary soldier who served in these campaigns, the experience was one of endless marching, endless fighting, endless distance from home. You might enlist as a young man and spend 20 years under the standards, seeing lands you had never imagined, fighting peoples whose languages you could not understand. If you survived, you might return home wealthy with plunder. Or you might return broken and poor, your farm long since lost to debt, your family scattered or dead. This was the cost of empire, paid in human lives and human suffering. The glory belonged to the generals who celebrated triumphs through the streets of Rome. The sacrifices were borne by the common soldiers, whose names were never recorded, whose graves were scattered across 100 battlefields from Spain to Syria. And as Rome grew larger, new tensions emerged. The wealth pouring in from conquered lands enriched some Romans beyond imagination, while others sank deeper into poverty. The old farmer soldiers, who had been the backbone of the Republic, found themselves displaced by slave labor. Unable to compete with the great estates worked by captives from Rome's many wars, the republic that had governed a city found itself struggling to govern an empire, its institutions creaking under the strain. But these troubles are for the next part of our story. For now, let the image of Rome's expansion stay with you, not as a tale of triumph, but as a human story full of courage and suffering, ambition and loss. The empire was not built by emperors alone, but by the countless ordinary people who marched and fought and died to make it possible. Rest here for a moment, if you wish. Feel the weight of the centuries settling around you like a warm blanket. We have traveled far together, and there is still further to go. But there is no rush. The story will wait for you, patient as stone, ready to continue whenever you are. The fall of the Republic, ambition and sorrow. The Roman Republic had endured for nearly 5 centuries, surviving invasions and civil conflicts, growing from a city to an empire, developing institutions that balanced power among competing groups. But in its final century, all of that began to unravel. The forces that had made Rome great, the ambition of its leaders, the loyalty of its soldiers, the wealth of its conquests, now turned inward, tearing the Republic apart from within. This chapter of our story is marked by violence and tragedy, by great men who believed themselves above the law, and by ordinary people caught in the middle of struggles. They could neither control nor escape. The troubles had been building for generations. As Rome expanded, the gap between rich and poor grew into a chasm. Wealthy senators accumulated vast estates, worked by armies of slaves, while the small farmers, who had once formed the backbone of both Roman society and the Roman army, lost their land to debt and competition. Veterans returning from long campaigns found nothing waiting for them. Their farms failed, their families scattered. The city of Rome swelled with displaced, poor, angry, and desperate. A population ripe for exploitation by ambitious politicians. 2 brothers tried to address these problems peacefully. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were aristocrats who championed the cause of the poor, proposing land reforms that would redistribute public land to landless citizens. They were popular with the masses, but threatening to the wealthy elite who controlled the Senate. Both brothers were killed by political opponents. Tiberius in 133 BCE and Gaius in 121 BCE, their deaths marking a turning point. For the first time, political violence had been used to settle domestic disputes in Rome. It would not be the last. The decades that followed saw the rise of a new kind of leader, the military strongman. These were generals who commanded the personal loyalty of their soldiers, who used their armies not just to defend Rome, but to advance their own political careers. The first of these was Gaius Marius, a brilliant commander who reformed the army, opening it to the landless poor and creating a professional fighting force. His soldiers owed their livelihood to Marius personally, not to the state, and this shift in loyalty would have profound consequences. Marius's rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, another talented general with his own loyal troops. Their conflict plunged Rome into civil war for the first time. Sulla eventually triumphed, marching his army into Rome itself, something that had been absolutely forbidden under Republican tradition. He declared himself dictator and unleashed a reign of terror, posting lists of his enemies and offering rewards for their deaths. Thousands were killed, their property confiscated, their families ruined. When Sulla finally retired and died, he left behind a republic deeply scarred and a precedent that other ambitious men would follow. Imagine yourself living through these times. The streets of Rome, once relatively safe, now echo with the sounds of violence. Armed gangs loyal to different politicians clash in the forum. Neighbors inform on neighbors, hoping to profit from the prescriptions. No one knows whom to trust, what tomorrow will bring, whether the city that has stood for centuries will survive another year. You keep your head down, try to protect your family, and pray to whatever gods might be listening. Into this chaos stepped three men who would shape the final decades of the Republic. The first was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, a military hero who had conquered lands from Spain to Syria, who believed his services to Rome entitled him to special honors and powers. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who had made his fortune through shrewd investment and shameless exploitation, and who craved the military glory that had eluded him. The third was Gaius Julius Caesar, a brilliant politician and general from an ancient but impoverished patrician family, whose ambition knew no bounds. These three men formed an alliance, the first triumvirate, pooling their resources and influence to dominate Roman politics. It was an uneasy partnership, held together by mutual benefit rather than friendship. Pompey married Caesar's daughter, Julia, binding them by family ties. Crassus sought military glory in the east, leading an army against Parthia that would end in disaster and his own death. And Caesar, given command of the legions in Gaul, embarked on a decade of conquest that would make him fabulously wealthy and dangerously popular. Caesar's Gallic wars extended Roman rule to the Atlantic and the English Channel, bringing vast territories and enormous wealth under Roman control. But they also created a personal army of battle-hardened veterans who owed their loyalty to Caesar alone. When the triumvirate collapsed and the Senate, backed by Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, Caesar faced a choice: obey and risk prosecution, exile, even death at the hands of his enemies, or march on Rome with his legions and seize power by force. On January 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar led his soldiers across the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper. Crossing it under arms was treason, an act of war against the Republic. Caesar allegedly remarked as he crossed, "The die is cast," knowing that there was no turning back. The civil war that followed lasted for years and ranged across the entire Mediterranean world, from Spain to Egypt to North Africa to Greece. Pompey was defeated and killed. Crassus was already dead. Caesar stood alone, master of Rome. He did not call himself king. He was too shrewd for that, knowing how deeply Romans hated that title. Instead, he became dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, accumulating powers that made him king in all but name. He reformed the calendar, giving us the year of 365 days that we still use today. He extended citizenship to peoples throughout the empire. He planned vast public works and military campaigns. He seemed unstoppable, inevitable, permanent. And then, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, he was dead. A group of senators, calling themselves liberators, surrounded him in the Senate house and stabbed him 23 times. Their leader was Marcus Brutus, a man Caesar had trusted and favored, whose betrayal gave rise to the famous dying words attributed to Caesar, et Brutus, u2 Brutus. The assassination was meant to save the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into another round of civil wars, even more destructive than the last. Caesar's adopted heir, the young Octavian, joined forces with Caesar's loyal general Mark Antony and another commander, Lepidus, to hunt down and destroy the conspirators. They unleashed new proscriptions, killing thousands, seizing fortunes, turning citizen against citizen in a frenzy of vengeance. Once the conspirators were defeated, the triumvirs turned on each other. Lepidus was sidelined, forced into retirement. Antony and Octavian divided the empire between them, an uneasy peace that could not last. Antony allied himself with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and seemed to be building a power base in the east independent of Rome. Octavian, controlling the west, positioned himself as the defender of Roman tradition against foreign influence. The final conflict came in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra, their cause hopeless, took their own lives. Egypt was annexed as a Roman province, its legendary wealth flowing directly to Octavian personally, and just like that, after nearly a century of civil wars, the fighting was over. Octavian stood alone, unchallenged, the last man standing after the bloodbath that had consumed the Republic. He was 32 years old. He would rule for another 44 years, transforming Rome from a republic into an empire, becoming the first of the Roman emperors under the title Augustus. But that is the next part of our story. For now, let us sit with the sorrow of what was lost. The Republic, for all its flaws, had been an attempt at self-government, a system that balanced competing interests and distributed power among many hands. It had produced great achievements and terrible injustices, as all human systems do. And now it was gone, swept away by ambition and violence, replaced by the rule of one man. For the ordinary Roman who lived through these decades, the experience was one of unrelenting fear and uncertainty. You never knew when the next prescription list might include your name, when soldiers might appear at your door, when everything you had built might be taken away. You learned to keep your opinions to yourself, to avoid attracting attention, to survive however you could. And when the wars finally ended, when Augustus offered peace and stability in exchange for freedom, most people accepted the bargain gratefully. They were exhausted. They wanted only to live their lives, raise their children, grow old in peace. If that meant accepting an emperor, so be it. The price of liberty had proven too high. Let these reflections settle over you gently, like dust on ancient stones. The fall of the Republic is a story of human failings, of ambition unchecked and institutions overwhelmed. But it is also a reminder that even in the darkest times, ordinary people find ways to endure, to adapt, to carry on. The story continues, but there is no need to hurry. Rest here as long as you need. The empire rises, Augustus and the Pax Romana after the chaos and bloodshed of the civil wars. A new era began. Octavian, the young heir of Caesar, who had fought his way to supreme power, now faced a different challenge. It was one thing to win a civil war. It was quite another to build a lasting peace. The Republic was dead, but its forms and traditions still commanded respect. The Roman people had overthrown kings once before. They might do so again if their new ruler seemed too tyrannical, too much like the monarchs their ancestors had expelled. Octavian understood this danger, and his genius lay in finding a way to hold absolute power while appearing not to. In 27 BCE, he stood before the Senate and made a remarkable announcement. He was returning power to the Senate and people of Rome. The emergency was over. The civil wars won, and normal government could resume. The senators, stunned and perhaps suspicious, responded by heaping honors upon him. They gave him the title Augustus, the revered one, a name that carried religious weight without the taint of monarchy. They granted him authority over the most important provinces, where most of the legions were stationed. They created new offices and powers for him, wrapped in republican language, but amounting to something unprecedented. Augustus, as we will now call him, became the first Roman emperor, though he never used that title himself. He preferred princeps, first citizen, suggesting that he was merely the leading man in a government of equals. The facade was elaborate and carefully maintained. The Senate still met, elections were still held, magistrates still served their annual terms. But behind it all, everyone understood that Augustus held the real power. His approval was necessary for any important decision. His displeasure could mean ruin or death. For the ordinary Roman, this transformation was felt more as relief than loss. The civil wars had been devastating, killing perhaps a quarter of the male population of Italy, disrupting trade and agriculture, spreading fear and uncertainty into every corner of life. Now, under Augustus, there was peace. The legions guarded the distant frontiers instead of marching against each other. The roads were safe for travel, the seas cleared of pirates, commerce flourishing as it had not for generations. Imagine yourself in this new Rome, perhaps a generation after the wars ended. You have heard stories from your parents and grandparents about the terrible times, the proscriptions and battles, the neighbors who disappeared in the night. But for you, such things are only stories. Your Rome is a city being transformed, gleaming with new marble buildings that seem to spring up everywhere. Augustus famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and the evidence was everywhere you looked. The Forum, heart of Roman public life, was expanded and beautified. New temples rose to honor the gods and, subtly, to celebrate Augustus himself. The great altar of peace, the Arapacis, depicted the emperor and his family in solemn religious procession, linking his rule to divine favor and Roman tradition. Aqueducts carried fresh water into the city from distant springs, feeding fountains and baths that made life cleaner and more comfortable than it had ever been. But Rome was only the center of something much larger. Augustus reorganized the administration of the provinces, creating a system that would govern millions of people across 3 continents. Some provinces were controlled by the Senate, governed by traditional magistrates who served for a year or 2 before rotating home. Others, especially the frontier provinces where the legions were stationed, were under Augustus's direct control, ruled by his personal representatives who served at his pleasure. The legions themselves were transformed. During the civil wars, Armies had been raised and disbanded as needed, their loyalty uncertain and their behavior often uncontrolled. Augustus created a standing professional army, 28 legions, of roughly 150,000 men, supplemented by auxiliary troops from subject peoples. These soldiers served for 20 years or more, receiving regular pay and the promise of land upon discharge. They swore loyalty to the emperor personally, not to the abstract state. This ensured both military effectiveness and political stability. As long as the emperor maintained their support, the years that followed, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, lasted for roughly 2 centuries. It was not perfect peace, of course. Wars continued on the frontiers, revolts flared and were suppressed, and the succession from one emperor to the next was sometimes bloody and chaotic. But within the empire's borders, most people experienced a level of stability and prosperity that their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. Trade flourished along the network of roads that connected every corner of the empire. Grain from Egypt fed the masses in Rome, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, spices from the East, all flowed along trade routes protected by Roman power. Cities grew and prospered, their inhabitants enjoying amenities like public baths, theaters, and arenas that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. Latin spread as a common language, joined by Greek in the eastern provinces, creating a shared culture that transcended local differences. After Augustus died in 14 CE, after 41 years of rule, the succession passed to his adopted son, Tiberius. The precedent of dynastic succession had been established, though it would prove unstable in practice. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that followed produced emperors of wildly varying quality. Tiberius was competent but gloomy, increasingly withdrawn from public life. Caligula, who followed, was erratic and possibly mad, assassinated after just 4 years. Claudius, unexpectedly elevated to power, proved a capable administrator who expanded the empire to include Britain. Nero, the last of the line, began well but descended into cruelty and megalomania, eventually driven to suicide as his support collapsed. Yet even through these turbulent reigns, the empire itself remained stable. The machinery of government that Augustus had created proved remarkably resilient. Governors administered their provinces, legions guarded the frontiers, taxes were collected, and public works maintained. The emperor might be a genius or a fool, a reformer or a tyrant, but the system continued to function. After the chaos following Nero's death, a new dynasty emerged, the Flavians, who brought renewed stability. Vespasian and his son Titus were competent rulers who restored order and left their mark on Rome with monuments like the Colosseum, the great amphitheater where gladiators fought and wild beasts were hunted for the entertainment of the masses. Then came the era often considered the golden age of the empire, the reigns of the 5 good emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These men, spanning most of the 2nd century CE, are remembered as wise and capable rulers who governed for the benefit of their subjects rather than their own glory. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia and briefly holding Mesopotamia. Hadrian consolidated these gains and traveled tirelessly throughout his realm, leaving monuments like the Great Wall in Britain that still bears his name. Antoninus Pius enjoyed a peaceful reign of 23 years, remarkable for its lack of major crises. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, emperor, spent much of his reign defending the frontiers against increasing pressure from Germanic tribes, yet found time to compose his meditations, reflections on Stoic philosophy that are still read today. For the ordinary person living under these emperors, life was as good as it would ever be in the ancient world. If you were lucky enough to be a citizen, especially in Italy or one of the more developed provinces, you enjoyed legal protections, access to public amenities, and opportunities for advancement that were remarkable by any historical standard. Even non-citizens, the vast majority of the empire's population, benefited from the peace and prosperity that Roman rule provided, though they also bore its burdens in taxes and occasional conscription, of course. This picture must be balanced against the empire's darker aspects. Slavery was ubiquitous, with millions of human beings treated as property, subject to the whims of their owners. Women had limited legal rights, though their actual influence varied widely depending on circumstances. The poor, in Rome and throughout the empire, lived lives of grinding hardship, dependent on the grain dole and public games to keep them fed and distracted. And at the frontiers, Roman expansion meant conquest and subjugation for peoples who had never asked to be part of this vast machine. But for now, let us dwell in the golden afternoon of empire, when the Pax Romana seemed eternal and Rome's dominion unchallengeable. The roads stretched to every horizon. The legions held the frontiers. The cities gleamed with marble and bronze. If you were alive in this era, you might have believed that this order would last forever, that your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would live their lives under the same stable sky. You would have been wrong, of course. Nothing lasts forever, not even Rome. The cracks were already forming, invisible to those who lived through these golden years, but clear enough in retrospect. But that part of the story still lies ahead. For now, rest in the peace of the Pax Romana. Let the stability of those centuries wash over you like warm sunlight. If you are still with me, thank you for walking through these ages together. Feel free to let your eyes rest as we continue whenever you are ready. Cracks in the marble. The 3rd century crisis, the Golden Age, could not last. By the end of the 2nd century, the strains that had been building beneath the surface began to break through, shattering the peace that generations had taken for granted. The 3rd century of the Common Era was a time of almost unrelenting crisis, when the empire that had seemed invincible came close to complete collapse. Understanding this period helps us see how fragile even the greatest human achievements can be, and how ordinary people find ways to survive when their world falls apart. The troubles began with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, the last of the 5 good emperors was succeeded by his son Commodus, breaking the pattern of adopted heirs that had brought capable rulers to power. Commodus was not fit to rule. He neglected his duties, indulged in excesses, and eventually was assassinated by his own household in 192 CE. His death triggered a civil war as various generals competed for power, a grim echo of the conflicts that had destroyed the Republic 2 centuries before. The eventual winner was Septimius Severus, a tough military man from North Africa who founded a new dynasty. But the lesson had been learned. The army made emperors, and the army could unmake them just as easily. The legions became kingmakers, demanding ever higher pay and donatives, loyal not to Rome but to whichever commander offered the best rewards. This shift in power would have catastrophic consequences. The Severan dynasty ended in 235 CE with the murder of Alexander Severus by his own troops. What followed was 50 years of chaos, unprecedented in Roman history. In this period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, at least 26 men claimed the title of emperor, most of them rising through military coup and dying by military coup within months or years. The average reign was less than 3 years. Many emperors never even visited Rome, too busy fighting on the frontiers or against rivals closer to home. Imagine the disorientation of living through such times. Your grandfather remembered the stable reign of Marcus Aurelius, when emperors served for decades and the borders were secure. Now you cannot keep track of who rules, whose face appears on the coins that pass through your hands, whose name the local officials invoke when they demand your taxes. The coins themselves tell the story of decline. Once pure silver, they are increasingly debased with copper and bronze, their value uncertain. Prices rising as merchants lose faith in the currency. The external pressures were just as severe. Germanic tribes pushed against the northern frontiers with increasing force, no longer content with occasional raids but seeking permanent settlement within the empire's borders. In 251 CE, the Emperor Decius was killed fighting the Goths, the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy. In the east, a new power had risen, the Sasanian Empire of Persia, far more formidable than the Parthians who had preceded them. In 260 CE, the Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur I, an unprecedented humiliation. He would die in captivity, never to return to Roman soil. The empire began to fracture. In the west, a general named Postumus established a breakaway Gallic empire, controlling Gaul, Britain, and Spain for over a decade. In the east, the city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, carved out an independent realm that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia. Rome itself was reduced to controlling only Italy and a few surrounding provinces, a shadow of its former self. For ordinary people, the crisis meant lives of perpetual uncertainty. The roads that had once been safe for travel were now haunted by bandits and deserters. Trade dried up as merchants refused to risk journeys through contested territories. Cities that had flourished for centuries shrank behind hastily constructed walls, their populations reduced by warfare, plague, and flight. The Great Plague that had begun under Marcus Aurelius continued to flare throughout the 3rd century, killing perhaps a quarter of the empire's population over several generations. The countryside suffered terribly. Farms were abandoned as farmers were conscripted into armies or fled from invading bands. Fields that had produced grain for generations went fallow, adding famine to the list of miseries. Those who remained faced crushing tax burdens as the imperial government demanded ever more to fund its endless wars. Tax collectors, backed by soldiers, stripped communities bare, leaving nothing for the next season's planting. And yet, through it all, people survived. They adapted to the new reality, finding ways to protect themselves and their families in a world where the old certainties had vanished. Local communities became more self-reliant, organizing their own defense when imperial troops were unavailable. Wealthy landowners began to assemble private armed forces, proto-feudal arrangements that would continue to evolve over the coming centuries. In many ways, the crisis of the 3rd century planted seeds of the medieval world that would eventually emerge from Rome's ruins. The empire's recovery, when it came, was gradual and incomplete. The Emperor Aurelian, ruling from 272 to 75 CE, managed to reunify the fractured realm, defeating both the Gallic Empire and Palmyra. He built new walls around Rome itself, the Aurelian walls that still stand today, a tacit admission that the city was no longer safe behind its ancient boundaries. But Aurelian was assassinated before he could consolidate his achievements, and the instability continued. The final resolution came with Diocletian, who seized power in 284 CE and would rule for over 20 years, longer than any emperor since Marcus Aurelius. Diocletian recognized that the empire had become too large and complex for one man to govern effectively. He divided it into eastern and western halves, each ruled by a senior emperor called an Augustus, assisted by a junior emperor called a Caesar. This system, the Tetrarchy, was meant to ensure stable succession and effective administration. Diocletian also enacted sweeping reforms to stabilize the economy and the army. He attempted to fix prices and wages through an edict that, while largely unsuccessful, showed the desperation of the times. He reorganized the provinces into smaller units, doubled the size of the army, and created a massive bureaucracy to administer it all. The empire that emerged from his reforms was very different from the one that had existed under Augustus or the 5 good emperors. It was more authoritarian, more militarized, more stratified, but it survived. The persecutions of Christians that occurred under Diocletian remind us that religious tensions were also part of this turbulent era. Christianity had been spreading steadily throughout the empire for 2 centuries, attracting converts with its message of salvation and community. Periodic persecutions had failed to stop its growth, and by the early 4th century, Christians made up a significant minority of the population. Particularly in the eastern provinces, Diocletian's persecutions were the most severe, aimed at eliminating the Christian church entirely. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy arrested and executed. Many Christians died for their faith during these years. But the persecution failed. Christianity was too deeply rooted to be exterminated, and within a generation, it would go from persecuted religion to official faith of the empire. For those who lived through the 3rd century crisis, it must have felt like the end of the world. The structures that had seemed eternal, the roads and legions and marble cities, were crumbling before their eyes. Many people turned to religion for comfort, seeking meaning in a world that seemed to have lost all stability. Mystery, cults, Christianity, and other faiths offered hope of salvation, whether in this world or the next. And yet, looking back, we can see that the crisis was not quite the end. The empire would continue for another 2 centuries in the West and over 1,000 years in the East. The reforms of Diocletian and his successors bought time, allowing Roman civilization to persist and evolve even as it changed beyond recognition. The world that emerged from the crisis was different, but it was not nothing. It was simply the next chapter in a story that had many chapters still to come. Let this reflection on crisis and survival settle gently into your thoughts. In times like these, people did not know if they were witnessing the end or simply another chapter in a story that would somehow continue. Often it is only in retrospect that we can see which it was. And sometimes the answer is both. Rest now, if you need to. The story is not finished, but there is no hurry. We will continue together whenever you are ready. Division and transformation, East and West. The empire that emerged from the 3rd century crisis was transformed in ways both visible and profound. What had been a single realm governed from Rome became 2 halves, increasingly distinct in language, culture, and destiny. The reforms that saved the empire also changed it irrevocably, setting the stage for the final chapter of Roman history in the West and the continuing story of Byzantium in the East. In this section of our journey, we will explore how division became transformation, and how the fall of Rome was not quite the ending it is often imagined to be. Diocletian's tetrarchy, the system of 4 emperors ruling together, did not long survive its creator. After he retired in 305 CE, the first emperor ever to voluntarily give up power, civil war broke out among the remaining rulers and their would-be successors. The eventual winner was Constantine, a general who would reshape the empire more dramatically than anyone since. Augustus. Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain in 306 CE, but it took him nearly 2 decades of warfare to achieve sole rule over the entire empire. During this struggle, in 312 CE, he experienced a vision that would change the course of history. On the eve of a crucial battle at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, Constantine reportedly saw a cross in the sky with the words in this sign, "Conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields, won the battle, and from that moment forward, linked his fortunes to the Christian faith. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted toleration to Christians throughout the empire, ending centuries of persecution. But Constantine went further, showering the church with favors, building grand basilicas, and involving himself in theological disputes. By the time of his death in 337 CE, Christianity had been transformed from a persecuted minority religion to the favored faith of the emperor himself. Within another 50 years, under Theodosius I, it would become the official religion of the empire, and paganism would be outlawed. Imagine the magnitude of this change. For 1,000 years, Romans had worshipped their traditional gods, Jupiter and Mars, Vesta and Juno, along with countless local deities and imported mystery cults. Now, within a few generations, all of this was swept away, replaced by a religion that proclaimed one God and one path to salvation. Temples were closed or converted into churches. Festivals were suppressed or transformed into Christian holidays. The very calendar was reoriented around the birth of Christ. For ordinary people, the transition was often gradual and incomplete. Many continued to practice old rituals in private, to leave offerings at sacred springs, to seek the blessing of spirits their ancestors had honored. But the public face of religion was now Christian, and over time, this became the private face as well. By the 5th century, the empire was overwhelmingly Christian, and Roman identity had become intertwined with Christian faith. Constantine also made another decision that would shape the future. he founded a new capital. On the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, Constantine built a new city that bore his name, Constantinople. It was designed to rival Rome itself, with forums and palaces, churches and hippodromes, all built on a magnificent scale. Constantinople would become the center of the Eastern Empire, gradually eclipsing Rome in importance. It was better positioned strategically, closer to the wealthy provinces of Egypt and Syria, easier to defend against both Persian and barbarian threats. As the Western Empire declined, the East flourished, and Constantinople became the greatest city in the Christian world, a position it would hold for nearly 1,000 years. The division between East and West became permanent after the death of Theodosius I in 395 CE. From that point forward, there were always two emperors, one in each half, and the halves increasingly went their separate ways. The East spoke Greek and looked toward Constantinople. The West spoke Latin and remained nominally centered on Rome, though emperors increasingly resided elsewhere. The Western Empire's decline was gradual but relentless. The wealth that had once flowed into Rome from conquered provinces dried up as those provinces were overrun or simply ceased to provide revenue. The army, once the backbone of Roman power, became increasingly dependent on Germanic soldiers and officers, many of whom had more loyalty to their own tribes than to the empire they served. Political instability continued, with emperors rising and falling at the whim of military strongmen. The Germanic peoples who had been pressing against the frontiers for centuries now began to move inside them, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as refugees fleeing other peoples, sometimes as invited settlers. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Franks, all established themselves within the empire's borders, carving out kingdoms that acknowledged nominal Roman sovereignty while exercising real power themselves. In 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign army occupied the Eternal City. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological blow was devastating. How could Rome fall? Rome, which had conquered the known world, which had seemed as permanent as the hills themselves. The great theologian Augustine wrote his masterwork, The City of God, partly in response to this shock, arguing that the true city of Christians was heavenly, not earthly, and that the fall of Rome was of no ultimate significance. But Rome continued to exist, and the Western Empire limped on for another 60 years. It was a shadow of its former self, its effective territory shrinking with each passing decade, its emperors increasingly puppets of Germanic generals. The end, when it came in for 76 CE, was almost anticlimactic. The last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustus, was simply deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer, who saw no need to replace him. The imperial regalia were sent to Constantinople, and the Western Roman Empire was no more. And yet, it would be wrong to see this as simply an ending. The Eastern Empire continued, flourishing for centuries, preserving and transmitting Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology. We call this realm Byzantium, but its inhabitants called themselves Romans and saw their state as the direct continuation of the empire of Augustus and Constantine. Byzantine civilization would endure until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks, 1,000 years after the Western Empire's end. Even in the West, Rome did not simply vanish. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced imperial administration were not wholly foreign. Their kings often served as Roman officials, maintained Roman institutions, and patronized Roman culture. Latin remained the language of education, law, and religion, gradually evolving into the Romance languages that millions speak today. Roman law provided the foundation for legal systems across Europe. Roman roads continued to carry traffic, Roman aqueducts to carry water. Long after the legions were gone, most importantly, the Catholic Church preserved and transmitted Roman civilization through the centuries of upheaval. Bishops became the most important figures in many cities, maintaining order and providing services that the state could no longer offer. Monasteries became centers of learning, copying ancient manuscripts and educating future generations. The Pope in Rome claimed spiritual authority over all Christians in the West, creating an institution that would shape European history for the next 1,000 years and beyond. Rome was not so much falling as it was becoming something else, something that would echo through the centuries to come. The empire dissolved, but its legacy persisted, transformed and renewed in ways that the last Romans could not have imagined. The medieval world that emerged from Rome's ruins was different, certainly, but it was built on Roman foundations and continued to look back to Rome as the model of civilization itself. For the ordinary people living through this transformation, the changes were often gradual and local. Life in a village in Gaul might continue much as it had for generations, regardless of who claimed to rule in distant capitals. The crucial things, planting and harvest, birth and death, faith and family, persisted across all political changes. Rome provided the framework within which life happened, but life itself was always more than Rome. Let this understanding settle gently into your thoughts. Transformation is not the same as destruction. Endings can also be beginnings. And the story of Rome, even after the fall of the Western Empire, was far from over. It continued in Byzantium for another millennium. It continued in the church and the law and the languages spoken by millions. It continues still in ways we sometimes recognize and sometimes do not. The story nears its end, but not quite yet. Rest here for a moment, letting the centuries wash over you, feeling the continuity beneath the changes. We have traveled so far together, from the shepherds on the 7 hills to the transformation of a world. One more chapter remains. The long goodbye, the fall of the West, and Rome's legacy. We have come at last to the end of our journey. Though, as we have seen, endings in history are rarely as clean as we might wish. The year 476 CE is traditionally given as the fall of the Roman Empire, the moment when the last Western emperor was deposed and the ancient world gave way to the medieval. But by now, you understand that this date, while significant, is somewhat arbitrary. The empire had been transforming for centuries, and that transformation continued long after the last emperor was gone. What we call the fall of Rome was not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow metamorphosis, a gradual shift from one way of organizing society to another. Let us return one more time to that rooftop in Rome where our story began. But now the city below you is different. It is the late 5th century, and Rome is no longer the capital of an empire. The population has shrunk dramatically from its peak of over 1 million souls to perhaps 50,000 or fewer. The great forums are quiet, their columns cracked, weeds growing between the paving stones. The aqueducts still carry water, but they are no longer properly maintained, and some have fallen into disrepair. The Colosseum, where crowds once cheered gladiators and exotic beasts, stands mostly empty. Its games abandoned as too expensive and too pagan for the Christian city Rome has become. And yet, life continues. Below you, people go about their daily business, buying bread, carrying water, tending their gardens. The church bells ring at the appointed hours, calling the faithful to prayer. A bishop holds more real power in this city than any emperor ever did, organizing food distribution, mediating disputes, providing what services the crumbled government cannot. The Pope claims authority over the spiritual lives of Christians throughout the West, and that claim is increasingly recognized. Imagine yourself as one of these late Romans, walking through a city built for millions, but now home to mere thousands. You pass monuments celebrating victories over peoples whose names you barely recognize, inscriptions in a Latin that has already begun to shift and change into something new. You know that you are Roman, that your ancestors have lived here for generations beyond counting. But the Rome of your daily life bears little resemblance to the Rome of legend and history. Your grandfather might have remembered the last days of the Western Empire, might have seen the Germanic soldiers marching through the streets, might have wondered what would become of everything he knew. But for you, those are just stories. The world you know is the world that is, a world of petty kingdoms and powerful bishops, of local strongmen and traveling merchants, of faith and survival and the daily struggle to get by. The Germanic kings who now rule Italy, first Odoacer, then the Ostrogoths, then the Lombards, are not entirely foreign. They have lived among Romans for generations, adopted Roman customs, even converted to Christianity. They admire Roman civilization and try to preserve what they can of it. The laws they enforce are often Roman laws, adapted to new circumstances. The officials who serve them are often Romans. Maintaining the administrative traditions that have governed this land for centuries, this is the reality of Rome's fall, not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden darkness, but a gradual fading, a slow transformation, a story that has no clear beginning or end. The historians who would later divide history into ancient, medieval, and modern were looking for neat boundaries that did not really exist. The people living through these centuries saw only continuity, each generation building on what came before, adapting to new circumstances, finding ways to carry on. And what of Rome's legacy? Here the story becomes more hopeful, for Rome never truly disappeared. It transformed, evolved, and persisted in ways that shape our world still. The Latin language lived on, splitting into the Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian. These languages carry Roman roots in every sentence, connecting hundreds of millions of modern speakers to the ancient world. When you speak any of these languages, you are speaking a form of Latin, evolved and changed, but still recognizably descended from the tongue spoken in the Forum 2,000 years ago. Roman law provided the foundation for legal systems across Europe and, eventually, the world. The concepts of contracts and property, of rights and obligations, of citizenship and justice. All trace their roots to Roman jurists who codified and rationalized the principles of human social life. When you sign a contract, when you invoke your legal rights, you are participating in a tradition that began in ancient Rome. Roman engineering left physical monuments that still stand, still inspire, still function. The Colosseum and the Pantheon draw millions of visitors each year, marveling at what human hands could build with stone and concrete and ambition. Roman roads, many still traceable on modern maps, established routes that subsequent generations would follow. Roman aqueducts, though mostly in ruins, demonstrated principles of hydraulic engineering that would not be surpassed for centuries. Roman architecture and city planning shaped how we build and organize our communities. The grid pattern of Roman military camps became the template for countless cities across Europe and the Americas. The arch, the dome, the basilica, all Roman innovations, continue to inspire architects and builders today. Roman literature and philosophy have been read and studied continuously for 2,000 years. Virgil and Ovid, Cicero and Seneca, Marcus Aurelius and his Meditations. These writers speak across the centuries, their insights into human nature and society as relevant now as when they were first set down, and Roman Christianity became the foundation of Western religious life. The Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome, carried Roman traditions, Roman language, and Roman organizational structures into the medieval world and beyond. The Orthodox churches of the East, centered on Constantinople, preserved another strand of Roman Christian tradition. Between them, they shaped the spiritual lives of billions of people across two millennia. Perhaps most importantly, Rome gave the Western world its idea of civilization itself. For countless generations, Rome represented the pinnacle of human achievement, the standard against which all subsequent societies measured themselves. Kings and emperors styled themselves heirs of the Caesars. Nations claimed descent from Rome to legitimize their power. The very word empire comes from the Latin imperium, the authority to command that Rome wielded over its vast domains. Even Rome's fall became a template, a warning, a meditation on the transience of human glory. The image of the eternal city crumbling into ruin haunted European imagination, inspiring artists and writers, philosophers and politicians. We still ask ourselves, what caused Rome to fall? As if by understanding its end, we might prevent our own civilizations from suffering the same fate. And so we come to the close of our journey together, here on this rooftop, overlooking a city that is both ancient and eternal, both fallen and enduring. The shepherds on the 7 hills could not have imagined what their small settlements would become. The emperors in their marble palaces could not have imagined how their empire would transform and persist. And we, looking back across the centuries, can only marvel at the resilience and creativity of the human spirit, which built something so vast and carried it forward in so many forms. Rome never truly fell. It changed, evolved, transformed, but it never disappeared. The Rome of Augustus became the Rome of Constantine, which became the Rome of the medieval popes, which became the Rome that tourists visit today. And beyond the physical city, Rome lives on in our languages, our laws, our architecture, our religions. Our very concept of what it means to be civilized This is the lesson I hope you carry with you as you drift toward sleep. Nothing truly ends. Everything transforms. The story of Rome is still being told in every courthouse and cathedral, in every sentence spoken in a Romance language, in every child who learns about Caesar and the Colosseum. You are part of that story, connected across the centuries to those shepherds on the 7 hills, to the soldiers who marched along the Roman roads, to the ordinary people who lived and loved and struggled and survived through all the centuries of Rome's long history. Thank you for spending this time with me, walking through 1,000 years of history. If this journey helped you relax tonight, if it carried you gently toward sleep on a river of centuries, I would be honored if you would subscribe and join me for another journey soon. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more quiet evenings to spend exploring the past together. Sleep well, dear listener. May your dreams be as enduring as Rome.